My name is Dario Hasenstab. I have 2 degrees in international affairs, and I'm here with Balder Hagritz, a former university professor of mine, as well as an IR consultant. And together, we're bursting the Western bubble. Today, we will analyze how to understand global realignment through the lens of the Western bubble, because while Western societies have many strengths and significant weaknesses, in order to analyze these, we use the concept of the Western bubble. If you would like to know more about this concept, how this podcast started, or who we are, make sure to listen to our introduction episode. Hi, Balder. Why are we speaking about this topic today, and what even is global realignment?
Hi, Dario. Well, global realignment is something that we have referenced in the past, maybe not specifically with that term, but it is the idea that the old Western order, if you like, the global order that was set up over the past 80 years or so and has its roots all the way back to the 17th century, is on the decline, is maybe even ending. And in very simplistic terms, the global south or the non-Western world, if you like, is starting to create dynamics that are outside of the control of this traditional order, so outside of the control of Western dominated United Nations politics, Western dominated IMF politics, World Trade Organization politics. And you can see this with things such as the BRICS, which we have discussed previously, countries from the global south coming together and say, how can we create a cooperation agreement, a cooperation system that doesn't follow London or Paris and New York? And another very important aspect of this is the Chinese initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative, the idea of China trying to make at least the global economic order center around Beijing or center around China as a kind of throwback to, if you like, the Silk Road times of thousands of years ago. So we see a world that is rapidly changing where the Western systems are no longer as influential, where people are looking for alternatives, and that leads to a global realignment of geopolitics, of dynamics that are no longer within reach of London or Paris or New York.
And what are the facts?
The Belt and Road Initiative is a Chinese investment program started in 2013 with the goal of placing China at the center of global trade. This is accomplished with a focus on large infrastructure projects in mostly developing countries, such as a high-speed rail in Kenya or a new deep-water port in Sri Lanka. Last week, the 10th anniversary celebrations of the Belt and Road Initiative were held in Beijing, and a number of world leaders traveled to China. The guest of honor, however, was Vladimir Putin in his first trip outside the former Soviet Union territory since the ICC issued a warrant for his arrest. Afghanistan's Taliban were also present, with China receiving a preliminary team who went to start their ascension into the Belt and Road Initiative.
What is the bubble?
So when we're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative and this global realignment, I think it's important first to understand why is it so important to China, this Belt and Road Initiative.
China has developed its economy and its geopolitical presence on the world stage, if you like, incredibly rapidly since essentially the death of Chairman Mao. Since the 1980s, China has growing very, very fast. But initially, in the 80s, in the 90s, and maybe in the beginning of the 21st century, that was done by still following, if you like, the traditional Western order, the 20th century post World War II system created by Europe and North America, Japan, etc. And over the past 15 years or so, certainly with the ascension of Xi Jinping, China has started feeling increasingly uncomfortable with that because they need to follow rules that do not correspond with their own internal domestic politics, with their own perspectives on the world. And they want to go towards a situation where China actually, from their perspective, is respected sufficiently, is seen sufficiently, but also in control sufficiently of global dynamics, given their increasing importance in the global economy in terms of GDP, in terms of trade, etc. So this is a way for China to say we need to, if you like, align away, if that is a word, to realign away from that old school Western type of thinking in order for us to be able to fully flourish. And we want to take the rest of the world with us. Anyone who wants to join us, please, excuse me, join us. We are going to be the center of a new dynamic, a new model to how countries can develop, a new model to how countries can cooperate, because we know that we're not the only ones who feel uncomfortable with this Western dominance, with this Western bubble, if you like.
And so when this was announced in 2013, I mean, the West, and we'll get to that in a second, was obviously a bit uncomfortable. But the rest of the world, I would say, reacted to this in a rather, welcoming way, right? So this is a huge infrastructure project. And I don't know if I at this time, I would say rising power, right? Rising global power announced that they're going to invest a lot of money into the world. That has a very nice ring to it. If I'm the leader of a country in the global south that maybe really needs a railway.
Yes, it is important here to distinguish between the reaction of states, of governments on the one hand, and local populations on the other hand. So if you are a average stereotypical newly independent country, newly independent in the sense of decolonized, right? In the 1960s, you decolonized from Western oppression, if you like, and now you're facing a world in which you have two different opportunities. One, you have the West, who offers you investments based on an awful lot of Western values. You need to democratize, you need to liberalize, you need to embrace the IMF, you need to embrace the World Bank, all those kinds of things. Or you've got China who just says, hey, here we've got a big bag of money, we'll build a railroad, we just want access to your gold mines, or we just want access to your oil. Then that Chinese offer is much more attractive. It's much easier to implement, it's much easier to deal with. Even the fact that there is an alternative is already important, right? Because until recently, the only thing you could do is just basically try to adapt to the wishes of the Europeans and North Americans to get any foreign investment in at all. And the fact that now there's another source of potential investment is useful. Now, at a local level, from a local population perspective, the reaction has been a little bit less enthusiastic. There has been a lot of resistance by populations who weren't happy with their own governments making decisions towards China and maybe away from the traditional, neo-colonial powers, if you like. But overall, from a geopolitical perspective, certainly the global south, and again, the word global south is a little bit of the term is a little bit confusing, and I'm just using it simplistically here. But the global south, from a Westphalian geopolitical perspective, has said, hey, this is good news because now we can actually choose our own destiny, and we're no longer beholden to, if you like, this Western mafia that says, hey, that's a nice place you have there. It would be a shame if anything happens to it, right?
And these leaders, particularly from the global south, have been very happy to welcome these investments. And I mean, we even see this when we look at global trade, and here particularly at South trade, right? So large parts of global trade are going through the West, right? Either it's between the West, or it's going into the West or out of the West. But this South trade is not yet at the scale where you could see it based on, for example, if you look at how the population is distributed among the globe. And this has increased, right? So from kind of 17% of South trade in 2005 to in 2021, 28%. And there are some serious sources that attribute a lot of this growth to the Belt and Road Initiative, simply because, well, if you suddenly start connecting countries in the global south, then they're obviously going to trade with each other.
Yes, it is difficult often to put your finger exactly on what the drivers are, but it is just a fact, it is just a neutral observation that the West no longer, or is becoming less and less, let's put it like that, is becoming less and less the core of global economics. If you look at the long-term dynamics and these statistics that you mentioned show that, but there are other statistics when it comes to GDP, when it comes to an awful lot of other long-term statistics. You see a world that where the West no longer has the power that it used to. And that is just an observation, just a fact. Then there's the question, how do you react to that? But it is happening. And no one is going to stop it. Why? Because countries like India, like China, but also South Africa, Nigeria, Brazil, they all have huge populations. They've got highly educated populations. They've got huge resources. There is no need for them to always be focused on London, Paris, Berlin, or Washington, or New York. It is all about reality where the rest of the world is starting to see opportunities outside of that Western model. Now, the question is, how do we react to that, right? But the fact that it's happening is just a neutral observation. It's there.
It could be a neutral observation, but it's not for the West, right? Because from a Western perspective, there was, I mean, I don't remember in 2013 too much how the reaction was. I remember there was some kind of excitement and some, oh, that's a big number, right? There was this announcement that China would invest $1 trillion over the span of a few decades. So that's a huge number, right? And that in itself is like, oh, as you said, a neutral observation. However, it immediately became a concerned observation as soon as Western countries started to realize, where does this Belt and Road Initiative end, right? If it ends in Pakistan, that's okay, you can have Pakistan, right? But it very quickly became evident that no, it was not going to end in Pakistan, but it was actually extending all the way to some Greek ports. There are even some parts of Germany where the Belt and Road Initiative ends, especially with regards to the railways. And that then very quickly became a concern, right? So first a security concern from an inter-Western perspective of, do we want to have the Chinese own our ports? And then it became a concern of, are we losing out here? Why are other countries not choosing our gracious development offers? And why are they suddenly choosing the Chinese ones?
And that is very telling, that perspective, that the way that the West straight away thinks about, hey, how does this divide the world, right? Rather than saying, hey, there's an interesting initiative here, maybe we should see how we can somehow benefit from this. How can, let's see if there are parts that we can join. Is this going to make, for example, consumer goods in Europe cheaper? Surely that's a good thing from your average European perspective. No, the reaction was straight away as if this was a challenge to their divine right to dominate global politics, right? This hardcore bubble thinking of the West saying, the moment China or Russia or anyone else offers an alternative, that is a challenge to our divine status in international relations. And that, of course, is exactly the damage that this kind of bubble does, and what something that we'll discuss later, that the reaction of the West is not one that is rational. It is one that is based on this internal bubble delusion, this belief that anything that gets developed outside of their own comfort zone, anything that gets developed that doesn't sound capitalist, liberal, and democratic, has to be somehow something dark, has to be something that threatens the world and not just them. That's where the West is at its ugliest, right? They have not just tried to convince the world, but they have deeply convinced themselves that they are the only rightful controllers of humanity's destiny, of our future.
Because from a rational perspective, and I don't know if you remember this, but I once wrote this in an essay for you, so this must have been ages ago. There's also a clear environmental benefit to this, because if you move trade between China and, let's say, Europe onto rail, you first of all cut the transport time from, I believe, 6 weeks down to 14 days, and you obviously cut global emissions, right? So I remember writing this from this perspective of an environmentalist, if you want to call it that, saying that, hey, this could be great, right? If you move all of the exports, I mean, just the trade between China and the EU onto rail, this would be amazing, right? And we would no longer have to be concerned about all those nasty pirates in the different straits on that path.
I, I I'm not naive enough to think that Chinese initiatives are only good. Of course, they aren't. In the sense, good in the sense of promoting human well-being across the world. Let's use that as the variable for what is good and what is wrong. Um, but here we've got an incredibly important country, just statistically 1.4 billion people, enormous GDP, enormous diplomatic ties, incredibly powerful country that is expanding its influence by building railroads. I mean, I'd much rather have that than countries bombing other places, military action across the world. Who engages in that kind of military action? The West. So it is somehow fascinating, but also highly disturbing to perceive a West that feels threatened by the building of railroads, while at the same time having military interventions across the globe against the will of local populations. An alien comes from outer space and looks at the situation, they will point at China as the good guys. They won't point at China as the bad guys. Hey, they're just trying to connect the world. They're trying to connect humanity. Surely that is a beautiful, noble ideal, right? Now, again, before anyone misquotes me here, I understand that there are some serious and sometimes even nefarious consequences to what China is doing, but from a big picture perspective, it shows how deep the West has sunk inside of its own bubble.
Right, and now you need to, from a Western perspective, think, okay, how do we frame this, right? Because I mean, yeah, the Western ways weren't the nicest ways, with dominating global sea trade routes. So let's think about, from a Western perspective, how do you keep countries from the global South from actually allowing Chinese investments? And this is then when in 2017, in particular, this kind of like debt trap diplomacy term was coined, invented, I want to say, because there are some projects within the Belt and Road Initiative that, at least now in hindsight, I'm sure that leaders from the countries affected would not make those decisions again. And the most popular or the most famous example here is the deep sea port in Sri Lanka, right, where Sri Lanka had this deep sea port built by China as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and then unfortunately, the trade flows didn't develop the way they expected, and they couldn't basically repay this. And the consequence of this was a 99-year lease, where now China basically, and this is difficult, right, in the terming and in the framing, China basically owns this port now, and this was then always portrayed as one of the very negative examples of the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative.
And this is one of those situations where we find it difficult to look at nuance, right? So, yes, it is true that there are some dangers, but that is similar to me buying a house, mortgaging it out to the bank, and then mean at some point running into trouble because I made some bad calculations, or maybe because the bank advised me badly, it could be the bank's fault. And then the bank saying, hey, we're going to repossess your house. That is not great when that happens, and it's a problem, and it's something to be careful of, but it doesn't make China the evil villains of global politics, right? It is not that they militarily forced Sri Lanka to go into this agreement. The long-term consequences are also nowhere near as serious as Western media would like to portray this. It's not as if China now owns Sri Lanka commerce overall. They just have some rights in terms of commercial exploitation with respect to this port. So it then becomes a situation where people hear something about, oh, China has now essentially repossessed this port. This is another sign that comforts me, because it shows how evil and how negative and how destructive Chinese foreign policy, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is, while completely forgetting that when it comes to debt trap diplomacy, the champions of the past 70 years have been the West, have been the United States and Europe, heavily indebting countries in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, and only very reluctantly providing any debt relief, while basically holding it over the leaders of those countries as a sort of Damocles, like, hey, if you don't follow our political perspectives, if you don't follow our narrative, and if you don't have the kind of elections that we want, we're not going to forgive your debt. We're only going to forgive your debt if you do exactly as we tell you. So it's once again one of those situations where the West is just full of it.
I mean, that's the Western bubble. I mean, what this podcast is about is the democratic, value-driven West is doing this debt trap diplomacy, and then you have the authoritarian, communist, if you could call it that, China that is doing this. Right? This is obviously a huge difference, and I think this is what you can then observe in the overall framing and the narratives you see out there. So I've so far only heard about this deep sea port in Sri Lanka. But then in the research for this episode, that we received from our researchers, basically.
We should shout out to our amazing researchers.
Exactly. They have then basically hinted at the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway, which is a project in Kenya, right, connecting these two big cities, and which has contributed to more than 2% of Kenya's GDP in the past, right? So there's also very positive projects from the Belt and Road Initiative, but those we don't like hearing about in the West.
No, because it's one of those situations where bad news confirms our pre-existing notions of the evil nature of authoritarian regimes. Good news doesn't really seem to align with our way of thinking, and we'd rather block it out, right? So if when China or Russia or North Korea or Iran or anyone does something that any neutral observer would say, hey, that's pretty good, that has improved human well-being across the world or in a specific region, then we prefer to ignore it. When there's anything that sounds dodgy, that sounds problematic, then we very much like to make that part of our own confirmation bias process, right? Our own knowledge, our own conviction that we are right about China being the evildoers.
And to top all of this off, we have the President of the United States, Joe Biden, basically saying at I think it was one of the last G7 summits, where the G7 nations, Western nations, decided, this Belt and Road Initiative is really working to a certain extent in China's ways. We need to counter this somehow. So let's bring together the G7 Road and Belt Initiative. And there, while presenting this, he said, and I quote, "We got together literally billions of dollars in the G7 nations to provide for alternatives to China's, what they call Belt and Road Initiative, which is basically a dead and nose agreement that they have. There's not much going on. They are in real debt. They're going in trouble." End quote. Right, and here you have. This is the Western. Well, I mean, it's also the U.S. president, so I hope that he is the Western bubble in this sense. But this is, if I had to summarize the Western bubble for this episode, I think I would pick this quote.
I would expect millions of people who, over the past 40 years, have exactly experienced what it's like to be indebted to Western nations, pulling their hairs out when they hear that. Right? It's the hypocrisy is strong here. Look, powerful nations want to control less powerful nations, and of course there is a control mechanism that can be disturbing on the side of China, and it has led to problems, but the West kind of needs to have a very hard look at itself and say, well, hey, how can you complain about China when you have been responsible for your 80 years of exactly doing what you're accusing China of doing? And the damage of that, of course, is that the West doesn't understand it, and that's something that they don't understand those new dynamics. They don't understand why the rest of the world doesn't listen to Joe Biden, that kind of thing.
Well, but before we move on to the damage, there's one final aspect I think that would be really interesting to discuss for the bubble, and I think it shows the bubble, because right now we've been talking rather conceptually, right? But this is a very nice example to showcases the Western bubble thinking. And this is, I've read it out in the fact sheet, this 10-year anniversary meeting or celebration, where China invited everyone who's part of the Belt and Road Initiative to attend. We can say that fewer countries attended than in the past. That might be just a difficult global climate at the moment, also travel costs, or recent visits before. But here, again, from a Western perspective, and now from my own perspective, right? I was a bit sick last week, so I couldn't really follow the news as much as I would like. But when it comes to who attended the summit, and we put this into the fact sheet on purpose, what I got from the headlines that I was reading is that it was basically a meeting between Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and the Taliban. Sure, there were also some other nations, right? The ones nobody cares about, but those were basically, and Hungary was there. That we care about because it's in the West. But those are basically the three parties that met, the axis of evil. It was just Iran and North Korea were missing.
And so put yourself in the shoes of your average news consumer in Berlin or in London or anywhere in the West who doesn't really follow these things with any details, but follows the news, reads the newspaper once a day. They will now have this almost comical picture of their, the people that they've been told are the danger to the world, danger to democracy, the danger to liberalism. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and the Taliban of all groups, uh, sort of like the villains who have to be fought by superheroes, right? You've got the Avengers and you've got the villains that they're fighting, and those villains have some kind of summit of how can we destroy the world. That's the image that is being portrayed. Whereas in reality, of course, this was a meeting between many more countries, and it was a meeting that is very consistent with previous meetings over the past decade or so. So there's nothing nefarious about this meeting in itself, but if the Western press and Western politicians only talk about these three candidates, Putin, Xi, and the Taliban, of course that then reinforces the bubble, that reinforces our perspective on, oh, we're really in trouble because what did they agree on? What kind of terrorist attack will be carried out next, right? It's fascinating, it's funny, but not haha funny, to observe this.
Well, because notably there were some very serious countries attending, right? So not the usual suspects within the sphere of influence of China and Russia, right? But we're also talking about Ethiopia, Egypt, Indonesia, Pakistan, Hungary, Chile, Argentina. That's not the axis of evil, at least not yet. Who knows? I mean, you never want to count out these developments, but you have some very serious countries who have some very serious interests within this Belt and Road Initiative. And as I said, I mean, some of them really benefiting from it in the past. I mean, Kenya also attended, Tanzania. Right? Those are serious countries. And again, I mean, we are aware of this, that these countries attended, but I genuinely believe if you were right now, were you to ask random people on the street, probably half of them wouldn't know that the summit has happened. But the other half is going to tell you, well, who was there? Let me think. Russia, China, and the Taliban.
And these countries that you just named before, these are serious countries with serious leadership, and certainly leadership ambitions, right? I mean, Egypt has been traditionally a leader in the region, Indonesia, Pakistan, Argentina. These are major nations. And what is fascinating about that list, and there were more, she said, but Hungary is the only EU member, and that says something about our bubble, right? So Hungary is already in the West in sort of seen as like the black sheep of the family because of internal politics, where there's a lot of concern about the situation and the approach of Hungary towards the rest of the world. This is the only country that actually wants to connect to China at this moment, wants to connect to the Belt and Road Initiative. And that means that the rest of the West is left out of these dynamics. So you've got these very powerful, influential countries coming together and just say, how can we cooperate? What kind of things can we learn from each other? How can we benefit from each other? And the empty seats in the room are seats from Europe and from North America. In a world where statistically Europe and North America are losing ground, surely this seems like an enormous strategic blunder. There is a there is a middle ground between we do not want to fight China and we are going to submit to China. There is a middle ground where you say, hey, China is a powerful, legitimate nation. let's see how we can cooperate, and let's see where we've got a problem with them. But instead, the West is trying to implement a weird boycott, and the rest of the world, the global south, if you like, basically says, okay, you boycott whatever you like, but we're going to do business. Thank you very much.
And can you explain to our listeners what is the problem?
And we've mentioned it a few times already, but this is incredibly damaging. I mean, well, to the world in some extent, yes, but mostly to the West, because first and foremost, the West is missing out, right? It's only Hungary that's attending, and then Hungary is being told off about this, right? I mean, so you could see the reaction within the Western media that so you now have Xi, Putin, the Taliban, and Viktor Orban, right? The new axis of evil. So you have Hungary being portrayed in a very negative image. Nobody else is attending. Nobody else is interested in attending from the West. And as you said, the West is missing out economically. This could be, some form of new stability that we're talking, right? I mean, this is this interdependence theory, right? That the more economic trade there is, the more the likelihood of war is being decreased. But at least you're talking to each other. And with this, the West is just, blocking itself off of global cooperation, but it's also blocking global cooperation in general by kind of forcing other countries to show colors, right? To say, am I going, am I not going? Because let's say I attend the summit, how many Western ambassadors are going to call me up and complain about this?
Right, so nobody knows what the next 50 years will bring. And when I mean nobody knows, that's always been the case, but if you had asked your average international relations student in the 1990s, what is the 21st century going to bring? The answer would have been quite consistently in terms of, the world is going to turn Western, because that was the paradigm at that time, right? People believed that the West had found a golden formula, and we thought we knew, because we were wrong, but we thought we knew what the world would look like in 2050. Now, in 2023, nobody knows what the world's going to look like in 2080 or by the end of the 21st century. However, what is clear is that there's a train leaving towards that future, and the West is not on board, right? The West is sort of stuck at the station while everyone else has gotten on the train and say, okay, let's see where this train goes to. The West is still doubting what to do, how to behave, and not cooperating with these changing global dynamics. And the result of that is that the West is increasingly disconnected from a reality that's out there, a reality that they don't control, at least not at the moment because they choose not to engage with it, a reality that is very powerful, that has a lot of enthusiasm behind it from countries that feel that they now have an opportunity that wasn't available to them in the 20th century. And the result is that the West is only digging its own grave, right? It is only making itself less relevant in the future with respect to the rest of the world, desperately trying to cling on to what they have. And this is, by the way, very reminiscent of declining empires throughout history, right? The Roman Empire, at certain moments the Egyptian or the Chinese Empire, that in times of decline, in times of loss of power, they cannot connect with the new dynamics, with the changing world order. They desperately try to hide behind their walls and say to others, if you're not with us, then you're against us. And it only exacerbates the fall from grace, if you like. And that's exactly what the West is facing right now. And the danger, as you rightfully said, is that they're taking other countries with them as a result, because they're forcing other countries somehow to make this choice between either you're with those new dynamics or you stick with us, the good old good guys that will be here for you. As a result, the West is responsible for an enormous amount of tension and unnecessary lack of cooperation. Going back to your words before, they are blocking railroads to connect the world. I mean, if you're blocking railroads to connect the world, there is something wrong with you, right?
And I mean, what is always funny to me is theoretically, one of those Western ideals of free market, right? This is theoretically the free market. You have two players who are both offering solutions. Well, they pretend to offer solutions, and theoretically the rest of the world can choose. So this is, and whichever option works best for you, you choose. This is the free market, right? And then you have the West sitting there and saying, it is a very free market and you can choose whatever you want. But if you choose the other side, you're evil. This is like me saying, I don't know, what I need new shoes. Should I get Adidas or should I get Nike? And then Adidas tells me, a real German only buys Adidas. I would never buy Nike. That's because Nike, they're using slave labor and all the other evil things, and we're using child labor, not slave labor. So that's not as bad.
Yeah, so it's completely inconsistent, as it so often is. I mean, the hypocrisy is, astounding in the West. And I'm not saying this to sort of whack my finger at the West and go, boo, there's something wrong with you. It is just frustrating because if you engage in this kind of hypocritical thinking, you cannot actually look at productive and constructive alternatives, right? On top of that, I would add that yes, you're absolutely right that from a Western perspective, and also to a certain extent from Beijing's perspective, this is like a war between two alternatives. But the rest of the world, those countries that you mentioned, Argentina, Indonesia, Egypt, they are not necessarily seeing it like that. They're seeing it as a world order that is now absolutely multipolar, where it's not about who are we with or who are we against, simply what opportunities are there for our own country to thrive. What are the opportunities that we have available to us? And we are not interested in playing this game, but juvenile, who is the strongest, China or the West? It is not relevant to a lot of countries in the world anymore. They just see a world of opportunities. They want to be part of that. They want to benefit from that. And the fact that you've got the West desperately trying to play a game of, I need recognition, I need to be seen as the center of all your thoughts and all your actions, is just horribly antiquated.
To stick with my shoe analogy, this is basically not choosing either one of the big players, but maybe going with a local brand from, I don't know, somewhere in Brazil with sustainable supply chains and, I don't know, a friendly lady that sells you them.
And with maybe some good consultants from Beijing, right? I mean,
Exactly.
And what now?
So let's actually look into the future of me buying shoes and global supply chains and trade routes, because we are talking about a competition that the West cannot win. And here, as always, we also have the question: what would winning even look like? Like from a Western perspective, what do you want? You don't want China to succeed in controlling global trade routes. Okay, what do you want? Right? Apart from that, do you just want to be destructive, right? Stop the railroads from being built, or do you want to create anything else, anything of value for once?
and the deep emotional answer to that, which people would never articulate, because first of all, it's not feasible, and it's also it's not moral, is, well, we the West really want to control those trade routes, right? But that is of course not a practical, realistic scenario. So there is no scenario of winning. There is no clarity about what actually needs to be achieved. And this is something that you see in international relations all the time. It's particularly visible in moments of crisis. We talked about it with respect to Ukraine. The question of what is it exactly that your optimal outcome looks like is a fundamental question to ask, because then you have something to work towards and to communicate and maybe to cooperate on. Say to China, hey, we're not comfortable with what you're doing because we're afraid that this is the outcome, but we've got an alternative outcome and maybe we can find a middle ground. But without that alternative outcome, without knowing what winning is, all you're doing is basically engaging in an emotional struggle, in a psychological fight with yourself and with others about who you want to be and who you want the world to be. And the result of that is, of course, very destructive.
You're managing. And this is another theme, right? We've had time and time again in this podcast, is that the West lacks vision of where it wants to go. It's now only managing problems. And this very much feels like it as well, right? That you have a bunch of managers trying to manage the impact of the BRI, trying to manage an alternative without actually... because I've said this before in the podcast, right? That I'm a big fan of these visions, right? Of someone saying, okay, this is where I want to take the world, and let's go this direction. And I feel like China did this with, I mean, obviously, I hate this is with self-interest. I don't see anything wrong with self-interest in this world. But China is saying that we want to go this way. We want to connect the world via rail because the West is dominating the global sea routes. So this is where we want to take it. And in the West, instead of saying, okay, we want to take it into this direction, it's very much we just don't want to take it in your direction. But we haven't really defined what our ideal direction would look like.
So that's a really scary scenario where you are a manager, but a manager with huge emotional baggage. So you're just managing a situation because you've got no long-term vision, you've got no long-term plan, but at the same time you've got a long history of build-up anger and resentment and insecurity and disconnect with your surroundings. Well, that is usually not a path to have a productive organization, to have a successful organization in which you're working, right? So exactly that. We have a dangerous formula of a West that doesn't know what it wants, but it desperately is trying to cling on to some past that no longer exists and is not going to come back. And it is dragging the world down with them if they're not careful, causing hardship not just for the rest of the world, but also for your average Western consumer, citizen, who will actually feel the results of this, who will wake up one day in 50 years' time and see a world that they are no longer influencing, that they're no longer connected to because the global realignment has moved on without them.
This seems like a great moment to end today's conversation on the global realignment. If you have any questions, comments, or regards, make sure to send us an email to thewesternbubble@gmail.com, and we will try to incorporate them in our following episodes. Thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. Make sure to join us again next week when we burst the Western bubble. That is it from my side. Balder, which closing quote did you pick for us today?
The Belt and Road Initiative in many ways finds its roots in the Silk Road, the trade that happened thousands of years ago, even between the Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire, that went through the Middle East and that connected these enormous populations, while these populations essentially did their own thing, only traded with each other. And British historian Peter Frankopan wrote about this, and he said, "We think of globalization as a uniquely modern phenomenon. Yet 2000 years ago too, it was a fact of life, one that presented opportunities, created problems, and prompted technological advance."